I don't know whether you have a view on the parole board and how it operates, but like many of the things that you write about, it doesn't quite seem to do its job terribly well.
Well, I think there obviously have to be cases for parole on occasion, and there are undoubtedly people who, after a while, should be let out. But I think the problem with people such as Pitchfork is that this is a man convicted beyond any reasonable doubt of serious murders. And there has been for some time, I don't know, I haven't checked lately, but it used to be one of the most fascinating figures in British criminology that every 3 years, two people in this country were killed by convicted murderers who'd been released on parole. It's one of my arguments. I mean, I don't support the reintroduction of the death penalty at the moment because I don't think that our judges are of high enough quality, and I think our juries aren't independent enough. But there are some cases, and the Pitchfork case seems to be one of them, where it seems to be very, very hard for anyone seriously to argue that the death penalty would not have been justified. And unless you're an actual pacifist and don't ever believe that society can defend itself against violence with violence, then I think you have to concede that. And part of my point about the released murderers killing people was this: people always say, well, you can't risk executing an innocent person. So indeed, you shouldn't execute innocent people. You should take endless steps to prevent yourself from doing that. But you can't make that a bar to a policy which is otherwise effective and useful. Because if you did, then, for instance, you could not release any convicted killers at all, ever. And sometimes there presumably are cases for doing that. I'm not. People think I'm a hanger and flogger, but I'm not actually in favour of very long prison sentences. I've visited prisons. They're terrible places, and particularly now that they're run by the inmates, they're far, far worse than they used to be. And most of us, if we were put in one of them, couldn't survive. We'd go crazy after 10 years. And I don't believe in long prison sentences for their own sake, which is one of the reasons why I think the death penalty for heinous murder is on occasion justified. This seems to me to be one of those occasions, in which case parole wouldn't really arise, would it?
Well, it wouldn't. I mean, I'm like you. I'm a bit squeamish about the death penalty, partly because I don't have great confidence in the system that would operate efficiently and correctly in every single case. But I do think that there are certainly cases where people who have committed certain types of crime should never be released on the basis that they will never be safe to be released. And if you are asking about whether it makes the world a safer place to lock up murderers and rapists, well, I think it does, because they're clearly not out there murdering and raping. And so I think that's a pretty straightforward case.
But there's also a very powerful deterrent effect, not against murder as such, but against the use of violence by criminals. A fascinating fact is that the numbers, again, I don't have them to hand, so I wasn't expecting to discuss this, but the numbers of attempted murders and serious woundings with intent are rising greatly. Now, if these crimes, which often involve terrible injuries to the victim, had happened in the early 1960s or 1950s, almost all the victims would have died, which would mean that if we had the homicide, if we had the medical facilities of 1950 and 1960, huge numbers of people would now be dying after being attacked, and our homicide and murder figures would be immensely higher than they are. And this is concealed by the brilliance of trauma surgeons and health service and paramedics in saving the lives of their victims in thousands of cases a year. So we are actually concealing from ourselves a very great rise in the amount of savage violence in our streets, which has followed. I can't prove that it's the cause, but it's certainly followed the end of the death penalty. And also, of course, the carrying of lethal weapons by criminals has immensely increased since the death penalty was ended. So it's always been the powerful deterrent effect of it that seemed to me to be worth at least studying. But one has to divorce the argument about the death penalty from the emotionalism which also surrounds it from both sides to have a rational debate on it. In this case, I look at the Pitchfork case. I think what on earth is the point of not executing this person, given what we know him to have done?
Yes. No, I think that's a very good argument, and I think many people would agree with it. Let's talk a bit about your piece at the weekend on the border force, because it is single-handedly now becoming the biggest issue, I think, facing this government and this country. David Davis wrote a thread at the weekend about why he thought sending migrants to a sort of offshore registration centre would be the wrong idea, because he made out that actually in Australia, when they did it, it ended up costing more money per migrant than it would have done to actually house them in this country. And I said to him, the problem for the Tory party is that they must get to grips with this before it either destroys either the government and or the country.
Well, I don't know whether they can. I mean, I first wrote about this on a large scale. I looked it up the other day in January of 2019, and I was at that time pretty confident that we could have adopted this simple method of towing them back to France and saying to the French, we don't want them. And after a few weeks, or indeed a few months of doing that, I think the message would have sunk home. But that might have been possible at the time when it was still really tiny. And what I was pointing out was that a huge psychological barrier had been broken. No one had realized until 2019 or 2018 that you could actually get across the Channel so easily. The people smugglers hadn't realized it. Because they thought of the Channel as a difficult obstacle to cross. And once people stopped being afraid of it, there's no limit to how many people could come across. And we have had days in recent months, in recent weeks, when the official total of people who've got into the country by coming across the Channel has been more than 1,000 a day. And that, of course, doesn't count however many there are who are undoubtedly slipping in without being recorded by anybody. And the Border Force knows this, and knows that they're doing so because they've probably got a good reason not to be in any way registered. But we don't know how many. But if this is sustained at this rate for a year, then you have the population of a town the size of Brighton coming into the country every year. Whoever they are and whatever their motives are and whatever their reasons are for coming here, that is a major social and economic problem for the country, and one which you can't ignore. If there ever was an opportunity to take them back, it's plainly gone. The French won't accept it, and it would involve a terrible and probably disastrous standoff in the Channel. The Australian solution of putting them in a third country doesn't seem to be available to us, and we're constantly rumoured that Albania is going to take.
I don't know why they keep coming up with this rubbish.
I don't know. We simply haven't got this the amount of sea between us and our nearest neighbour that Australia has, nor have we got countries which are willing to do this for us. I don't know. I'm beginning to wonder whether this is in fact insoluble. And of course, there is the other aspect of it, which I never cease to harp on about because it is so important. None of this would have happened had it not been for the stupid policies of Anthony Blair and of David Cameron. Blair in destroying the stability of the Middle East with his Iraq war, and Cameron in destroying the Gaddafi regime in Libya, which was, as a lot of people knew at the time, and as Gaddafi played one of the main barricades to mass migration from the North African coastline to Europe. Both of those things were catastrophic, and we now find out all those who thought it was just a matter of theory as to whether we should do these stupid things or not now find out that it's a matter of practice. I don't see how, given modern diplomacy and everything else, that we can actually do much about it. But it certainly is not helped by the fact that there is probably nobody in the higher reaches of the civil service or politics who really believes that borders are worth defending.
Well, I think that's part of the problem from the European Union, isn't it? But I know that way back when Schengen was being sort of put together, there were 3 countries that opted out of the freedom of movement scenario, which meant that actually anybody could come in any way, shape or form. It was Ireland, the UK and Sweden. And those 3 countries decided that they would want more immigration than every other European country. And that's part of the problem as well, because it's never really been changed, that basic policy. And so because you can now, I mean, I spoke to a guy in the summer when we were talking about coronavirus restrictions, and he decided upon himself to drive to Greece. And he got in his car, put his car on the train, went to Calais. Nobody stopped him at Calais. He drove literally to Brindisi, I think it was, in Italy. And the first time he was asked for his passport was when he got off the ferry in Greece. Not at no point was he stopped anywhere. And I think that's a problem.
Until recently, I mean, when the migration across the Mediterranean became very widespread, France and Italy, for instance, began to enforce their borders, and so did some of the other Schengen members. But I've travelled from vast distances across Europe without being asked for a passport, and you can walk from one country to another. And I've walked from Germany to France and from Germany to the Netherlands without, as if it were from one town to another without any check. That's the state of affairs over there, and therefore, once you're into the European Union, you can, without very much difficulty, find your way to the Channel, and there it is. Not all of them come here. A lot of them want to come to Germany as well, but there are particular reasons why so many people want to come here, and I'll say it again. I don't blame them for wanting to come. Any more than I blame people for wanting to afford bigger houses than they have, or to have better jobs than they have. People should have aspirations, but there are barriers to these things from happening. And what the people smugglers are doing is they're trying to bypass those barriers and jump the queues and prevent people from doing the thing lawfully and properly. If you are going to have, I'm not sure at the moment how much immigration we need. I think less than we get by some way. But you should, I think, be able to choose who you let in and who you don't. Yeah. And you can't do that under this procedure.
Yes, and you should also be able to throw people out if they do not qualify, as per the man in Liverpool, who was denied applications after applications from as long ago as 2014, and yet he was still living here.
Oh, it was my old friend Richard Littlejohn keeps pointing out. You should remember that the hijack of the Afghan plane, which arrived, I think, at
yes.
years ago, and he said at the time, and I remember thinking the same thing. I'll bet you that everybody involved in this is still here 20 years hence, and this is incredibly difficult to remove people from this country. Not least because the countries from which they came are not, in many cases, particularly anxious to have them back. So they're not going to make the effort. It's also very expensive. I think we've with the mixture of open borders idealism and stupid wars, we may have done for Europe as it was. I think it actually may be over. It's just a matter of time as to when that actually happens.
Yeah.
It is extraordinary how once you have totally free movement of people, it changes the world.
Yeah.